This is Curtis Fiedler, wrestling coach and special ed teacher. When was the last time you wore a singlet?
Thank you for that. I appreciate that question. The last time I wore a singlet was 2006. So thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it, Lauren.
What makes a good life?
What makes a good life? Boy, you're going with the philosophical questions, aren't you? I think enjoying what you do and enjoying the people around you, and I think I've got a really good job that I enjoy doing and working with, and I enjoy the people I get to work with, and it makes, that's at least what I think makes for a really good life.
What could you do with $2 million to impact the most amount of people?
What could I do with $2 million to impact the most amount of people? When back in the day, before I became a teacher, I worked for the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Milwaukee. And we worked at a camp where we brought inner city kids out to go canoeing, fishing, stay overnight in the woods, and there was a high ropes course there too, and I don't think they could do the high ropes course anymore because it wasn't up to code anymore because it's old and they didn't have the money. So that's probably what I would put that money into, so those kids can enjoy the climbing of the rock wall or the zip line or all the team building activities that you can do out there with the high ropes course.
What are 3 interesting facts about you?
3 interesting facts about me. Gosh. One of my favorite ones always to talk about is my Uncle John Fiedler. My Uncle John was an actor back in the day. He passed away in 2005, but he was a regular on the Bob Newhart show. He was on the Munsters, Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie. He was in all these things. He was most well known for being the voice of Piglet on Winnie the Pooh, and he did all those Winnie the Pooh movies and shows up until about 2002, I believe, and then obviously passed away in 2005. So that is one interesting thing I always like talking to people about. The other one is I was originally going to be a social studies teacher, and the reason I switched from social studies to special ed was because I took this class at UW-Whitewater called Psychology of the Exceptional Child, and fell in love with it and had a lot of fun with it, and kind of got hooked on special ed and enjoy working with that clientele. The third thing interesting about me. Are you smiling because you're trying to get a specific story out of me? No? Okay, just checking. Third interesting thing about me, I would probably go with, gosh, I don't know. The third interesting thing about me is, trying to think. I'm not a very interesting person, am I, Lauren? Thank you for agreeing with me. Probably the what I talked about before, working for the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Milwaukee, because I enjoyed it and I thought it was interesting for me because I'm from backwoods Mineral Point, and here I am thrown in the middle of inner city Milwaukee, where it was a real culture shock for me, having being able to work with all these young kids that the majority, I think about 80% of the students that came out to the camp were African American. I want to say about 10 to 15 were Latino, 2 or 3% Hmong, and not very many Caucasian students. So I had a lot of work with inner city kids that I enjoyed a lot, and I was nervous going into it, and again, I'm from Mineral Point. Mineral Point, I think, has an African American population of like 0.6%. So it was real interesting and fun for me.
What's the last adventure you went on?
The last adventure I went on. Nothing too exciting. The one that comes to mind is it was an adventure because I think it was 2012 or 13, something like that. I took about 11 River Valley kids down to a place called St. Paris, Graham, Ohio, for a wrestling camp, and I had to. It's a really tough wrestling camp where you sleep on the wrestling mat and you do everything in the wrestling room, and it was very poor planning on my part because then I was also the assistant baseball coach and we made it to state that year. So the state tournament was the exact week. I had scheduled this camp long ago, so I had to go down there for 3 days. I had to fly from Columbus, Ohio, up to Appleton for the state baseball game. So it was an interesting week, and plus I had 11 River Valley kids, 11 kids that made me pull a lot of my hair out. So that was probably one of the most recent adventures I had that I can remember.
If you could make one rule that everyone had to follow, what rule would you make?
There are way too many rules I could come up with in this room. Probably the one rule I would probably come up with in this school is the rule that wheelchair-bound students can't continue to go after my ankles with their wheelchair. I think that rule needs to be enforced right now, and I might even talk to Mr. Blakely or Mr. Thatcher or Officer Andy to see if they can put that rule into play, because I'm pretty tired of a certain individual coming after me and me fearing for my life.
Who is your most interesting friend?
My most interesting friend. I've got a buddy who was a hilarious guy and still a hilarious guy. He's a character that's really that's why I would consider him interesting. He actually lives in Austin, Texas now. I'm going to see him next week actually in Austin, and he's definitely a character. A lot of things that just come to mind that are really hilarious. Majority of them not being able to talk about on a camera, but it's just he's the first guy that comes to mind.
What would be your ideal way to spend the weekend? What would be your ideal way to spend the weekend?
My ideal way to spend the weekend. I would love to spend the weekend doing something involving athletics. I'm going to coach 3 different sports this year: football, wrestling, and baseball. And it doesn't even have to involve me coaching. I would love to spend the weekend going to Wrigley Field or Miller Park or Lambeau Field, or going to the NCAA wrestling tournament, or something involving that. I'm a nut for sports, maybe too much from time to time, and just taking all that in and enjoying all the competition that happens. I think spending a weekend doing that would be a lot of fun to me, and I get to do that from time to time, but not often enough.
What would be your ideal way to spend the weekend? What sport would you be terrible at?
What sport wouldn't I be terrible at, Lauren? Probably, if you asked Mr. Thatcher what sport would Mr. Fiedler be terrible at, I guarantee you he'd probably say basketball. Coordination is not my greatest suit, but that's okay. Probably basketball.
If you weren't a teacher, what job do you think you would be really good at?
Right when I graduated, so this would have been December 2010. I graduated in December, so I had to look for jobs in January, and there's not very many teaching jobs that I was interested in January, so I ended up getting a substituting job at the place a student taught at, Stoughton, and I ended up working with a kids full-time there. But between graduating and getting this job at River Valley, I had actually filled out my application for, it's called the Wendelstadt School of Umpiring, and that's down in Florida, where I wanted to be a Major League umpire. So I was actually planning on going down to Florida to do that and see how I would do, and if I would get into the umpiring at minor leagues and maybe someday go into the major leagues. But didn't get a chance to do that, but because I'm here now, which is awesome. But I would have really enjoyed, and I think I would have been really good at officiating something, whether it was baseball or football or wrestling. I think that would have been a blast.
How do you relax after a hard day at work?
How do I relax after a hard day of work? I think I relax a lot like other people. I got no problem throwing on Netflix and going to my go-to shows, whether it's The Office or The West Wing or any of those shows that I enjoy watching on there. I'll play video games from time to time and enjoy doing that. That certainly passes the time. Hanging out with friends on whenever I get a chance to, going to Madison and seeing friends, or going to hang out with family back home in Mineral Point or in Madison, where a few of them live, and just doing that stuff to pass the time. But yeah, that's basically how I'm able to spend my free time of what little there is.
Where would you spend all your time if you could?
On a beach somewhere, far away from this cold and whatnot. I probably would still, I'd find some place probably with a little warmer climate, but I'd still love to be a part of sports in some way, shape, or form.
How did you end up at River Valley High School, and how long have you been here?
So this is year 7 for me. This is going to be my 7th year, and I've been, coaching or teaching something here every year. But I applied here. I knew some people here that encouraged me to apply, and rest is history, I guess. And I ended up having to work with you, which for the most part has been pretty awesome, I'd say. Yeah. There's some, again, I go back to that rule about going after my ankles. But yeah, for the most part, it's been pretty good. Wouldn't you say? Yeah.
When was the last time you climbed a tree?
Last time I climbed a tree, probably middle school. I don't know. I haven't had to climb very many trees lately. So I would guess middle school, maybe high school.
Thank you.
Well, that worked out good, didn't it?